Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're continuing our CPU and GPU scaling series, this time with a comparison between Intel's new Core i5-13400 and the tried and true AMD Ryzen 7 5700X. Now, as it stands, the Ryzen 7 processor is actually a good bit cheaper at around $190 US, whereas the 13400 is currently fetching $240 US, which is the MSRP for this part. As the most affordable 13th gen Core i5 part, the 13400 has quite a lot of you very excited, and while it looks quite good on paper, it might also look very familiar to some of you. With 6 P cores, 4 E cores, and a 20MB L3 cache, you might have mistaken it as the Core i5-12600K because, well, that's basically what it is. In fact, when compared to the 12600K, the 13400 P cores are clocked just 300 MHz lower at 4.6 GHz, so a mere 6% reduction there, while the E cores have been clocked down from 3.6 GHz to 3.3 GHz, and that's a slightly larger 8% reduction. Other than that, they are basically the same CPU, with the only other notable change being to the integrated graphics. The 12600K used the UHD 770, while the 13400 uses the UHD 730. Sounds trivial, but the 770 does pack 33% more execution units, so that it is quite a significant difference, though at the end of the day, you won't be gaming with either one of these solutions, so at least in that sense, it is a trivial difference. Now, when compared to the 12400, this newer 13th gen version, and I do say 13th gen with air quotes, it clocks 5% higher for the P cores, while the 12400 didn't offer any E cores at all. The 12400 was also limited to an 18MB L3 cache and used the UHD 730 integrated graphics. So that means when compared to the 12400, the 13400, it is a big upgrade for those of you looking at productivity performance, but at today's prices it does also cost 30% more. And as usual, for this content we will be focusing on gaming performance, so I thought it would be interesting to not only compare the 13400 with the 5700X, but also the previous generation value champ, the Core i5-12400, along with the Ryzen 5 5600. So we have 4 CPUs in total, all of which can still be purchased today for between $130 and $240 US. Now, given that this is a GPU scaling benchmark, we are obviously focusing on gaming performance, and in total we have a dozen games, all of which have been tested at 1080p using the Radeon RX 6650 XT, 6950 XT, and RTX 4090. Now, the reason for testing at 1080p is quite simple. We want to minimize the GPU bottleneck as we're looking at CPU performance, but by including a number of different tiered GPUs, we still get to view the effects of GPU bottlenecks on the CPU. As for the test system specs, we're using DDR4 memory exclusive here, as this older but much cheaper memory standard makes sense when talking about sub $250 US processors, though there are certainly scenarios where you would opt for DDR5, but for simplicity's sake, we've gone for an apples-to-apples comparison using DDR4. I've also decided to use G-Skill's Ripjaw's V-Series 32GB DDR4 3600CL16 memory, because at $115 US, it is a good quality kit that offers a nice balance of price to performance. The AM4 processors are able to run this kit at the 3600 spec using the standard CL16, 19, 19, 36 timings. The locked Intel processors, though, can't run above 3466, if you want to use the Gear 1 mode, and ideally you do want to use the Gear 1 mode, as the memory has to run well above 4000 before Gear 2 can match the performance of Gear 1. And the reason for this limitation is due to the fact that the system agent or SA voltage is locked on non-K-SKU processors, and this limits the memory controller's ability to support high-frequency memory using the Gear 1 mode. And I should note that all overclocking is locked down on these 13th gen parts. There are no special motherboards that can allow you to overclock. All of them are locked down. There is no non-K overclocking for 13th gen parts. So that being the case, I've tested the 12400 and 13400 using the Ripjaw's memory adjusted to 3466, as this is the most optimal configuration for these processors, short of going and manually tuning the subtimings, which we're not doing for this content. So let's get into the benchmarks. Starting with Watch Dogs Legion, we find very competitive results across the board, regardless of the GPU used. It's really crazy to see that we're actually not that GPU limited when using the 6650 XT. Sure, the 13400 was 21% faster with the 6950 XT, but that's actually quite a small margin given the difference in GPU power there. The GeForce driver overhead is also visible here, with the RTX 4090 coming in slightly slower than the 6950 XT. That means we saw the highest frame rates using the Radeon GPU, but even so, the 13400 and 5700X delivered basically identical performance. The Intel CPU is just 1.5% faster. Even when compared to the much cheaper Ryzen 5 5600, the 13400 doesn't look that impressive, winning that matchup by a mere 5% margin. Moving on to Warhammer 3, we see when using the 6650 XT that all CPUs are limited by the GPU at exactly 81 FPS, and even with the much faster 6950 XT, we're still quite heavily GPU limited, this time to around 180 FPS. In fact, it's not until we employ the RTX 4090 that we find the performance limits of these CPUs. The Ryzen 5 5600 and Core i5-12400, for example, both capped out at around 200 FPS, so very respectable performance there. The 5700X was, however, 12% faster than the 5600, while the 13400 was 9% faster than the 5700X. So ultimately, Intel does win in this game, though that doesn't mean the Core i5 is necessarily the better value choice, but of course we will look at that a bit later on in the video. Next up we have Hitman 3, and no, the 6950 XT and 4090 results aren't mixed up here. For whatever reason, the 40 series currently suffers from really weak 1% lows in this title, and presumably this is some kind of driver related issue. In any case, the average frame rate of the 6950 XT and RTX 4090 are quite similar at 1080p due to the performance being CPU limited. If we were to increase the resolution and therefore reduce the CPU limitation, we would start to see the 6950 XT trail the RTX 4090 by a larger margin. Of course, if we were to use much faster CPUs, then it wouldn't require a 4K resolution. But just want to make it clear that the 6950 XT is in no way a competitor to the RTX 4090. We are heavily limiting the RTX 4090 here at 1080p with these lower end CPUs, or at least lower end by today's standards. Now, the more limited and heavily utilized 12400 and 5600 did perform quite a bit better with the Radeon GPU, again due to NVIDIA's driver overhead, which sends performance backwards in high CPU utilization scenarios. For the most part though, there was little to no performance difference between these four CPUs. The A Plague Tale Requiem results are heavily CPU limited when using the RTX 4090 and 6950 XT. The 6650 XT, on the other hand, heavily GPU limited performance to 68 FPS, as all four CPUs could easily meet that performance target. Now, with the 6950 XT, we see that the 5700X and 3400 delivered the same level of performance, while the 5600 and 12400 were also comparable. However, things look a bit different with the RTX 4090, namely for the 5600, which appears overwhelmed by the additional overhead, dropping well below the 5700X with just 87 FPS on average. The 5700X and 13400 though did deliver comparable performance. Next up we have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 using the basic quality preset, as this is a competitive multiplayer shooter, so lower quality settings are typically used to not just boost frame rates but also make it easier to spot enemy players. With the 6650 XT we see that performance is largely GPU limited, with just a 7% performance difference between the fastest and slowest CPUs tested. The 5700X, for example, was just 3% faster than the 13400, so in other words, performance was basically identical. Moving to the 6950 XT largely removes the GPU bottleneck, and now the 5700X is a massive 37% faster than the 13400, which is a surprisingly large margin, very surprising in fact. The 13400 was just 5% faster than the 12400, so a very mild improvement there, while the 5700X was 20% faster than the 5600. We're also seeing similar margins with the RTX 4090, though due to the overhead here, the CPU limited results are slightly slower with the GeForce GPU. Spider-Man Remastered is a very CPU limited game, especially with ray tracing enabled. That said, we do see some performance improvement from the 6650 XT to the 6950 XT, particularly when looking at the Core i5 processors. Interestingly, the Ryzen processors did see a performance uplift when moving from the 6950 XT to the RTX 4090, around a 9% gain, while the 13400 saw a 7% improvement. I suspect memory performance is the key limiting factor for the Ryzen processors, and namely its DRAM latency, which will be responsible for why the Core i5s perform so much better here. Using the RTX 4090, the 13400 was 13% faster than the 5700X. The Shadow of the Tomb Raider results are quite interesting. Using the 6650 XT, the results are highly predictable. Here we're entirely GPU limited, so all CPUs were capped at 110 FPS. However, this limit was removed with the 6950 XT and RTX 4090. Now the results are CPU limited. Basically, the 12400 and 5600 were evenly matched, with the 13400 and 5700X also evenly matched, delivering around 8% more performance than those cheaper models. Moving along, we have Horizon Zero Dawn, and this title always seems to heavily favour AMD processors, and we're certainly seeing an example of that here. The 5700X was 17% faster than the 13400 when using the RTX 4090 and 9% faster when using the 6950 XT. Interestingly, the 5700X was slower using the 6950 XT, while the 13400 delivered its best results with the old RDNA 2 flagship. Moving on to the Cyberpunk 2077 results, we find when CPU limited, the game plays best with the Radeon GPU, evident by the fact that the 6950 XT was up to 12% faster than the RTX 4090, seen when using the Ryzen 5 5600. If we look at the 6950 XT results, we see the 13400 is 3% faster than the 12400, while the 5600 and 5700X both hit a wall at 154 FPS. Performance overall, though, was similar, with the 13400 beating the 5700X by a 6% margin. ACC has been tested using the medium quality preset, and as a result the game is heavily CPU limited, and we're seeing this even with the 6650 XT. Still, the 5700X was around 5 to 10% faster than the 5600, which also made it 7 to 10% faster than the 13400. The extra cores and small frequency advantage the Ryzen 7 processor has over the 5600 is clearly helping here, while the small frequency bump the 13400 enjoys over the 12400 is virtually worthless in this example. The Riftbreaker results are really interesting and perhaps in part explains why the AMD processors typically do poorly in this title for our CPU testing, which normally only features the RTX 4090. We see when using the 6950 XT, the 5700X and 13400 both delivered basically identical performance at around 140 FPS on average. However, when switching to the RTX 4090, we see some interesting changes. Firstly, the 5700X is slower, dropping 6% of the performance seen with the Radeon GPU. Meanwhile, the 13400 actually gains performance, becoming 8% faster, and that means with the GeForce GPU, the Intel processor is a massive 18% faster. So it's possible, had I used, say, the 7900 XTX, that the 13400 and 5700X would deliver comparable performance. Okay, last up we have Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and as you can probably tell, this title is very much CPU limited, and that's really the case regardless of the visual quality settings used. Here the 5700X is around 13 to 16% faster than the 13400, and interestingly, the Core i5 processor struggles the most with the RTX 4090, same we're looking at the 1% lows. Still, if you happen to be using a Radeon GPU, it's going to be very difficult to tell the difference between these two CPUs. Now, here's a look at the 12-game average data, and as you can see, the 5700X and 13400 are extremely evenly matched. Using the RTX 4090, the 5700X was a mere 2% faster, then 3% faster using the 6950 XT, and then back to 2% faster with the 6650 XT. So given those margins are well within 5%, I think it's fair to say that overall the 5700X and 13400 delivered the exact same level of gaming performance. It's also well worth noting that for gaming, the 13400 was just 4% faster than the 12400, which makes sense given it's only clocked 5% higher. Therefore, when it comes to gaming, the 13400 really isn't an upgrade over the 12400. That also means that, for the most part, it's not a great deal faster than the Ryzen 5 5600, despite costing significantly more. So from a value perspective, the 13400 does appear very weak. Finally, here's the cost per frame analysis, and for this one, I'm just going to compare the CPU cost, given all CPUs use the same memory, and motherboard prices are also very similar. That being the case, the Ryzen 5 5600 is by far the best value part here, offering a little over 20% more value than the 12400 and over 40% more than the 13400. Meanwhile, the 5700X is better value than the 12400 and significantly better value than the 13400, reducing the cost per frame by 27%. Of course, these margins are reduced once you factor in the motherboard and memory, but the point is, the 5700X presents as a far better investment for gamers at $180 than the 13400 does at $240. For productivity, the 13400 will fare a lot better, but even there, we've seen in the past that the 5700X and 12600K do trade blows depending on the workload. And I'd say best case, the 12600K is faster in an application like Cinebench, but again, it costs 33% more, so it's not exactly a clear win here either. Okay, so like the Core i3 13100, the Core i5 13400, it's pretty much dead on arrival, at least at the current asking price. If you're watching this video well into the future and this CPU is now heavily discounted, then possibly a good buy. That's something you'll have to evaluate. But essentially for Intel to be competitive here today, right now, these new locked 13th gen parts, which I say new because they are essentially just 12th gen processors with a new name, but whatever the case, they need to launch at the same price as the 12th gen parts that they are effectively replacing. So in other words, the 13400 should be coming in at the current asking price of the 12400. So in the case of the 13100, rather than being priced at $150 US, it should have launched at $130 US at the most. And really today should be at most a $100 part like the 12100F. The 13400, it just suffers the exact same issue. $240 for this processor makes no sense at all. Hell, it costs more than the Ryzen 5 7600. But worse than that is the fact that the 12400 can be had for $180. And while it doesn't have the 4 E-cores, gamers really aren't going to care about that. Also, heavens forbid a new generation of product actually offers something extra at the same price point. Sadly, this no longer seems to be a thing in the PC space, or at the very least, it's becoming increasingly rare. Then, of course, there's the Ryzen 7 5700X, which can be had for as little as $180 US, and the AM4 platform has almost endless affordable quality motherboard options, as well as cheap CPU upgrades. You'd really only buy the 13400 over the 5700X or 12400 because you were interested in productivity performance. But in that situation, the 13500 makes significantly more sense as it costs just $10 more, comes with twice as many E-cores, 20% more L3 cache, and clocks 4 to 6% higher. Not only that, but the 13400 will be around 5% slower than the 12600K, and with the 12600K now available for $250, what's exactly the point of the 13400? It's a locked part, which costs basically the same amount as the unlocked version, but then you can just spend $10 more and get the 13500, which has twice as many E-cores and more cache, as I said. So yeah, this one really is dead on arrival. It's a pointless rebranding that really just didn't need to happen. So in my opinion, for between $200 and $250 US, your best CPU options right now include the Ryzen 5 7600, Ryzen 7 5700X, or Core i5 13500. I can very easily make an argument for each of these options. They're all valid depending on your preferences, but in short, the 5700X is the value king. It can take advantage of affordable B550 motherboards and DDR4 memory. Meanwhile, the 13500, it's a budget productivity king. It can be paired with either DDR4 or DDR5 memory, and it's supported by a range of Intel 600 and 700 series motherboards. Then the Ryzen 5 7600. It's the least affordable of the three, but it offers by far the best gaming performance and is without question backed by a superior platform that will support future CPU generations. The 13400 though, unless it drops to at least $180 US, you can just ignore it completely in favor of one of the three processors just mentioned. And that is going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, do one of those, subscribe. There will be probably more GPU scaling benchmarks to come, and well, many more, or GPU and CPU scaling benchmarks, I should say, but there will be more GPU content and CPU content coming in the not too distant future. Some exciting stuff coming up on the channel. So yeah, just make sure you subscribe. That's all I ask. Just hit the subscribe button and do that. I don't know. Also, we do have Float Plane and Patreon, so you can do those things if you want to as well. They do cost money. They're not free like the subscribe, but you get some pretty cool perks in return. Monthly live streams with Tim and myself. We can ask questions live. We have a Discord server for members only, so that's a cool place to hang out, talk tech and all that sort of stuff. Behind the scenes content and Q&A. So some cool stuff there. If you're interested, check that out. If not, perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.